Now, let's turn to a different area, because the Labour government has set out more details about its plans to change the House of Lords during the King's speech. A new bill will phase out the remaining hereditary peers, whose presence in the Lords is described as, quote, outdated and indefensible. The Prime Minister previously said he would abolish the parliamentary chamber in its present form altogether. Well, joining me live here in Westminster is Darren Hughes, Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society, and on the line is Professor Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London. Thanks both of you for being with me. Meg, to you first of all, what do you make of the proposals you've heard so far?
Well, they're taking a very sort of piecemeal approach here, which is not surprising. I think it's quite practical and sensible that the bill that's in the speech, which is about the removal of the hereditary peers, is presented very much as a small first step. And one could say that it's unfinished business from the Labour government of 1997, really, because they had a bill in 1998-99 to get rid of, it was supposed to be all of the hereditary peers, but there was a cross-party agreement to ease that bill through, which resulted in 92 of them remaining. It was supposed to be a temporary measure, and here we are 25 years later, and we're still waiting for that change to happen. So it's not surprising that they want to move on that quickly. They framed it very narrowly to ensure that the bill doesn't get bogged down and delayed, I think. But they're also promising further stages of reform. And I think there are other things, and we might talk about that, which they can sensibly do without the need for legislation and do quickly. But after they've done this change, they're going to want to move on to larger scale stuff, which might prove a bit more tricky.
I'll come to that in a moment. But one of the things that perhaps was being considered but didn't make it in terms of what we saw today was having a sort of top-end age limit. Are you pleased that they backed off? Because I saw a calculation suggesting if the age limit was 80, you would actually mean losing, I think it's 3,671 years worth of experience would be gone.
Well, I think there was a statement in the Labour manifesto, which I think is a really important statement, and I certainly do hope they're going to be acting on that, which is that the House of Lords is too big. It hovers around 800 members, and even once you've removed the hereditary peers, it'll still be at over 700, even before you've appointed any new people, which is quite likely to happen to level the numbers up. So I think it's very important that they take measures to shrink the size of the House. I would have liked to see in the bill a commitment to a cap on the size of the House, to say it can't be any bigger than the House of Commons. I think a lot of people in the public would like to see that too. But the question is how you get there. The retirement age of 80, they were actually not suggesting should be introduced until the end of this Parliament. So they still might go with it, but it wasn't going to have an effect until this Parliament was over. And I actually think in the meantime, there are other things that could be done to get the size of the House down, perhaps by agreement between the parties to encourage people to retire, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, let me bring Darren Hughes in, because Darren, Meg there saying that just the size of the second chamber is too big. Is that an assessment you would agree with?
Oh, totally. It's grown far too large for what's required for the important work that a second chamber needs to do. And I think with faith and trust in institutions and politics being so very low at the moment, what's so encouraging about today is that the new government are trying to think about improvements to democratic institutions. Now, there's a long way to go on all this, but at least it's a start to get rid of the hereditary peers as step one.
But as Meg was saying, that's not a huge number.
No, well, it's 92 out of the 800. I mean, only China has a second chamber that's bigger, so the scale of the task is definitely large. But I think this is why the pressure needs to stay on here, because, as Meg also said, this measure of getting rid of the hereditaries was meant to be a 25-year, ended up being a quarter-century process. So we've got to keep up with the next stage of reform so we can get more democracy into the second chamber.
Here's the thing, though, Darren. You can put a cap at that end of the process, but if you keep appointing, you still have a very large chamber.
That's right, and I think what the principle that needs to underlie this is that lawmakers should be chosen by the people, not by prime ministers, and we can't rely on prime ministerial patronage to be self-contained. So we need to have the next stage of the process to be able to bring a little bit more sensibility into this. The 80 retirement age is a blunt instrument, but that's because the scale of the task to try and reform it is so difficult. They're very good at delaying and putting things off track, and I just think there'll be quite a few people across the road scurrying around trying to get the Prime Minister to change his mind. I hope he sticks to the manifesto.
Darren, a quick thought on the age of voting, because that was another thing that people were watching to see if there'd be a bill about bringing it down to 16. I don't think I saw that.
No, that wasn't in there, but it was in the government, the Labour Party manifesto. So hopefully we will see that. We were expecting it. We had a 60% voter turnout. We've got 5 million people missing off the electoral register. We've got to improve participation. And one way of doing it is to bring more people into the franchise, including 16 and 17-year-olds, and not go down the path of voter ID, which was putting up more barriers to voting. So look, this is a great start, but there's a lot to do. This is a big agenda.
Let's go back to Meg Russell, because one area we've not touched upon is the quality of the appointees.
Yes, well, I'm glad that you've asked me that, because there is another very important element of what was in the manifesto, which is something that they can do without legislation, which is to reform the appointments process. I totally agree with you about you can't control the size of the chamber unless you control the way in, as well as encouraging people to leave. So I think that limiting the numbers is very important, but they have also committed in the manifesto to improving quality. And there are certainly things that you can do there. We have an independent House of Lords Appointments Commission, which vets the names that are put forward by the parties. But at the moment, it has very limited power. It can only complain about them on what's called propriety grounds. But people have been pressing for years that its powers should be broadened to allow it to make recommendations on suitability. Another thing that it would be nice to see from Keir Starmer, which I hope we might see, is a commitment that he will always abide by the recommendations of the Independent Appointments Commission, because there was an occasion when Boris Johnson didn't do that, which demonstrated how actually relatively weak an organisation it was. So I think, again, there is a lot of public support for strengthening the independent oversight of the appointments process and taking some of that kind of unilateral power out of the hands of the Prime Minister to ensure that there are more quality checks in the process. And that's something that Keir Starmer could simply announce. It doesn't need to be in a bill. And I'm kind of hoping that we might be hearing that in the coming days and weeks, but we'll see.
Well, it's good to talk to you both. Meg Russell, thanks to you. Darren Hughes here with me on the green. Thanks very much. This is very clearly the start of House of Lords reform. Thanks very much for your time.